Hello, everyone. Today is the ACM Underclassmen meeting. There's a QR code to sign in on the left side of the screen. You can also sign in through the link in the description below, as well as there's the Slido code for asking questions for today's meeting. And so without further ado, I'll move on to ACM's upcoming events. So tomorrow, we'll be having an info session from Youth Code Jam. They'll be talking about career opportunities. So if you're interested in hearing more about career opportunities, Youth Code Jam will be a good place to go to. This will be mainly about like content creation, and also some of their volunteering opportunities as well. Their content creation will be paid. Further information will be provided at tomorrow's meeting. This will be a good opportunity if you're still looking for something to do over the summer, or still looking for like a full-time job. Our ACM general meeting this week will be about the Vision and AI Lab at UTSA. They'll be talking about some of their projects. One will be computer vision based, and the other will be more AI based, more neural networks based. So if you're interested in either of the topics, feel free to come out and watch the meeting on Wednesday. It'll be very informative on two of the main topics within vision and AI right now. On Friday, we have our Rowdy Creators weekly meeting. They'll be on their Discord channel hosting a weekly meeting. More information can be found in the Rowdy Creators chat, but they will be hosting it on their own Discord server. And it'll be from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. On Saturday, we're going to be having an ICPC practice. Starts at 10 a.m., ends at 1 p.m. And it'll be on the ICPC Discord server. Jess will be providing the problems, and you'll be trying to solve it on your own, or solving it together as a group. And other than those events, we also have an officer meeting today. All officer meetings will be completely virtual. Join us today if you want to learn about like more leadership opportunities, and definitely reach out to us if you're trying to run for an officer position for this year, because we need to know before our election, which will be happening sometime later in April. The officer meetings are at 3 p.m. On Mondays, and they'll be completely virtual. Message one of the officers if you're interested in just joining and looking at it. We'll be talking about how we handle certain situations within our meetings, as well as some of the postmortems of our meetings. And without further ado, I will start talking about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for web development. So some of the prerequisites for this video include our IDE, which will be Visual Studio Code. If you don't have it downloaded, here's the link to it. And we'll be talking about some of the extensions that we'll be using for today. So the first one is Live Server. So Live Server basically lets us host an HTML page, and it'll be able to see, to showcase all the changes in real time, which is very helpful in trying to basically work on a front-end project. You wouldn't have to go back and refresh your page every time. Bracket pair colorizer This one I mentioned in the Visual Studio Code extensions in the IDE workshop, but basically this is a good way in formatting your code in the way that you can tell what each bracket, brace, or parentheses is doing. It's very helpful for languages like Lisp, but also really helpful for JavaScript and things like that. It won't be super helpful in terms of HTML, but we have other things that will take care of that for us. Auto rename tag. This allows us to change the tag name of our HTML tags a lot more easily. It'll be changing the first half and the second half of the tag. Path IntelliSense. This lets us know like what files we have within a certain directory and lets us have easier access in tracking its location. CSS Peek. We'll be looking at what the CSS is of a certain class or ID, and this will help us and try to decipher how a class looks. Color info. This just lets us see what the color looks like of a of one of your CSS patterns or one of your CSS properties. And it'll just be helpful in just trying to see what the color is without navigating to your browser. And then prettier, this basically makes your code a lot cleaner. It's basically an auto lint. If you don't know what that is, it just formats your code for you. And it kind of provides a standard. And HTML snippets, basically you can just type the tag name rather than like all the angle brackets, and it'll automatically do it for you. Git lens, this one's optional, but it's very helpful in trying to see like all your GitHub commits and seeing like what's been changed and who's done the changing. So now that we've talked over some of our VS Code extensions, we'll get into the basics of web development. So web development, you want to understand what you're trying to build first. So create your design of what you want and where you want it. Think of your websites as rectangles, and these will be done like properly after you have added on your styling. But your first goal is to think of everything in terms of rectangles. And so something like Mozilla's homepage, if we look at it, we do see some rectangles on the page, but when you further dissect it, you realize pretty much everything is a rectangle. They're not evenly spaced apart. This is something you would be doing with your styling, but every single thing on the page is its own rectangle. And that's how we want to view pages and how we want to create the starter of the web page. Okay, so in order to start your web page, just make a small mock-up of rectangles on top of each other, basically denoting different sections. And then within each section, you want to create more rectangles on how you want it to look in a certain way. And then after you've done your mockup, each rectangle will now basically be an element in your HTML. Okay. So let's move on to HTML. So why is HTML important? HTML is still currently used in a lot of frameworks under the hood. They are the reason server-side rendering has become popular. And the reason server-side rendering is a lot more favorable than just pure JavaScript is because it doesn't have to be rendered within the browser. It basically means that there's already a web page before you even go onto the website. and it appears a lot faster than JavaScript for that reason. So let's go ahead and in order to start your HTML file, we'll be using HTML snippets, and just type in the doc and just let it autocomplete. We'll be doing this later in a demo of all the different tags. Div tag. Div tag is pretty much the general purpose tag. You can put content in it. Usually can create anything from it, and the looks of your div tag are really heavily determined by your styling from your CSS. The A tag, this allows you to link to other pages. So these pages could be external links like google.com, or they could just be local HTML documents, or it could just be like local documents in general. We'll see this. We'll see something like this for like styling, something similar, but that uses a different tag. Buttons. This allows us to create a button, and to make something further happen, we'll be adding on an on-click property, and this will be further looked at when we're doing JavaScript. The link tag. So this allows us to add on a style sheet. So in the format I've put down below, and the script tag. This allows us to add in our own JavaScript. And more than likely, you want to put in defer for the reasons I stated before, because JavaScript takes time to render on a browser. You want your HTML to happen first. And after your HTML has happened is when you want to add your JavaScript on top of it. And so what defer basically lets you do is defer all your JavaScript from happening. And it pushes your HTML to happen first, and then your JavaScript to happen second. So it'll force your JavaScript to happen afterwards. So let's move on to demoing some of our HTML. Okay, so doc. So now we have a whole document. So if we render the page, so go ahead and make it go live with the document. So now it's called document, and we'll be adding onto the body. So the first thing we want to try out is a div. So a hello world seems good. Okay, so hello world. And then we want to add in an A tag. So let's do A tag to, let's say, google.com. So the reason it doesn't appear is because there's no text. So let's just say Google. Okay. So if we go to Google, it can't find it because it's not a proper website. So we have to put HTTPS in front of it, and this is what makes it an actual website. So as you can see, it takes me to Google. And then we'll be talking about the buttons, which we'll be using later. So buttons, add click. And I will go ahead and remove this link because we will not need it later. And let's add another button, click to. And we can add two divs along with that of 0 and another div of 0 again. So what I'll be creating today is a basic click counter on the website. So basically, when I click add click, it'll make this change to 1. And when I click add click 2, it'll make this change to its previous number plus 1. And same with this one as well. So now that we have the HTML done, let's go ahead and learn about some CSS. Okay. So CSS, why is CSS important? It really customizes your website's look, making it whatever color you want, whatever style you want. And CSS is pretty much just as powerful for the front end as JavaScript in its own way. And it can even create images on their own if you know it very well. So I'll be showing like an example of that. There's been some pure CSS challenges recently of just people using straight CSS to create images or whatever they want. And here's an example of it. So this is someone's project that they did. And they basically created this whole image using only CSS. So if you wanted to go ahead and like paint with CSS, it's possible, but it's very difficult. But it is definitely possible and can showcase the power of CSS. But for our demo today, we're not going to get into something as technical as that. Okay, so CSS position. So the different types of position is your static one. Basically keeps it the same way as it will always be within basically the max width of a certain block. Relative, it can be moved based off certain params in the block. Fixed means that it'll be stuck within the block. It'll be stuck anywhere on the page, and absolute means it's fixed within within the bounds of your current parent element. So what that means is basically if we look at our code, the body is considered a parent element of these 5 elements. So absolute just means that it'll be somewhere inside that body tag. CSS display, basically we'll be mainly using the difference between inline and block. So block are pretty much on top of each other and inline are next to each other. So when we go back and look at our website, you can see that these buttons are right next to each other. So that's considered inline, and these numbers are on top of each other, which means those are block. Of course, there's different types of displays now that make creating things a lot easier, mainly Flexbox and Grid. But these are more advanced topics because they can cover a lot more things. Flexbox really exemplifies the use of boxes in like how I previously stated for your front-end tool, basically how you want to design your front-end. So the declaration in your CSS file would just be display and then flex. Okay. Now we want to talk about CSS margin and padding. The margin and padding are basically things surrounding your content. Padding just means it'll be surrounded by your content, but inside the border. So basically, if you still want a whole background, you would be using padding. Margin means more of outside of this element. I don't want anything next to it. And these two have 3 different declarations. So if you do margin or padding for one argument, it means 10 pixels on all sides. if you do margin or padding for 2 arguments, it means that the first argument applies to the top and the bottom, and the second argument applies to the left and the right. And if you're doing it with 4 arguments, it'll be on the top, right, bottom, and then left respectively. We're not going to showcase all of these today, but just wanted to let that be known. And there's CSS Color, which basically lets you set the color of your font and your backgrounds. So color lets you change your font color. Background color lets you change your background color. And we'll also be talking about CSS selectors today. So there's 3 different types of selectors, and then more on top of these as well, but uses these ideologies. So there's the ID selector, which means there's only one of something. So sometimes I want to use an ID. Well, we'll be using IDs for our buttons because we want to clarify which button is which. And then the class, classes basically mean all elements of this certain that are using this type of class, which could mean they'll be having their own. It's not dedicated to just one, but can reuse some of the same logic or styling of another element. And then there's tag, usually not very recommended because this applies to all tags, but there's some cases where this is probably what you need. And then we'll be talking about CSS variables as well. And this can help us keep track of colors and certain thematic elements. So all I have to do is set a color, and then we can use that for any of our classes or elements that we want to use. So let's go ahead and get into learning some CSS. So the first thing we have to do is implement it. So we need to add the link tag. So after we add the link tag, let's go ahead and match it to our CSS file. And what we want to do next is maybe we want to make hello world a lot larger and also have its own background. So let's go ahead and make this its own ID. And let's call it title. So after we have something called title, we can call it with the pound sign and then the selector name or the ID name. So title. And let's go ahead and make the background of this. Well, let's make it coral. And you can see that there's the background of Hello World there. What you could also see is that there's this margin right outside. And this is where you would use the tag change because this comes as part of the body. So body, we want to make sure there's no margins. And you can just do it as that. Okay. Okay, so let's change our, let's go ahead and name our elements, our buttons. So button 1, and then we can use the same classes for same classes for each button. So something we may want to do is put the put the button with the number next to each other. So let's go ahead and do that. So what you would do there is just create its own div for it, and we would be copying it over and we'll be copying it over like that. Let's do it for both. Okay, so what we see here is that they're still block. Maybe we'll want them on the left side and the right side. So what we can do is add like a section tag. And we can make sure that we can just set some margin for it of maybe 15 px, so 15 pixels, and also make the display to be inline. Okay. So right now you can't see that it's affecting it because there's no class assigned. So we just need to add the class of inline, or the class of section, and the class of section here as well. And we will also need to change this to we'll make another tag for this display to be inline. Okay, so info div. So now they're basically next to each other. If you want to put them on top of each other, what you would have to do is use either float or flex. We won't be going over that today, but it's something you could look into. And our title, we'll just add a margin to the bottom. So you can specify a certain margin area, and we can have that. So now we have two different elements, and all the styling is coming along. Maybe we want to have our buttons look a certain way. So let's say we'll have our buttons be green. So green button. And we'll have this button be a green button as well. If we can change that later, but let's just have it look like this, look like so. Okay, so right now we don't have anything, and we just make the background color of these to be green. And it has changed this. One more thing we could do is just see what it would look like adding a background color. Let's go with Indian red. And basically you can see that all of the background is set by just using the body tag. And that pretty much covers most of the topics I talked about in CSS. There's a lot more topics in CSS, but that's pretty much what I'll be covering. Matt, do we have any questions from the stream?
No questions yet.
Okay, then I'll just keep moving forward. And we'll be talking about JavaScript. So why is JavaScript important? It's probably the most versatile of all the languages I'll be teaching, and also all the languages currently. There's some on the up and up right now, but JavaScript is by far the most versatile. It's used for front end, it's used for back end, and currently its backend language, Node.js, is a very powerful backend and very easy to, I guess it has a lot of features that most backends don't, and a lot of support for it. And also a lot of the front end frameworks are now mainly written in JavaScript, and you pretty much only use JavaScript the whole time. And so this is why JavaScript is seen as probably the most powerful out of all three of the languages I'll be teaching. But there's a lot of different things that JavaScript can do. So JavaScript, plain old vanilla JavaScript, the purpose of it is for document manipulation. What you can do is you can keep track of your information for your application, but this will be destroyed on refresh basically. And you can just be changing the information that's being displayed on your own by finding the element and then changing what it looks like. And let's just start talking about some of the JavaScript variables. So JavaScript variables, there's let and const. Const is a variable that will not change, and let is a variable that will change. Okay.
I have a quick question about that.
Yes.
So what is a var?
Var is pretty much kind of both. Var is another way it's declared, but as JavaScript evolves, it's people don't want to be using var as much. Var is basically both, but it's not good practice to use var. That is why I left it out of the presentation, but it is still valid syntax. Okay. JavaScript objects. So objects are denoted with some like map format. So the name of an object is Leon and the clicks is set to 1. So this is kind of like this is a JavaScript object that has two attributes, which are name and clicks. And then there's JavaScript arrays, and these are useful to keep track of a list of information, which isn't what an object does really, but what you can do with an object is it can also have arrays, and then arrays can also have objects. So if we look at array, we're declaring the array with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and like an object with an array of a hello attribute, which is an array, but also has objects with name inside. And now I'll be talking about the job, just demoing the JavaScript. Okay, so first things first is you have to add JavaScript by adding the script tag. So we'll be using index.js. And then in index.js, let's go ahead and start trying to change this first one. And then we'll try to reflect it over to both. So let's say so the reason I'm using let here is because this number will be changing. Clicks equals to 0. And when we call, basically we'll be passing a function for the button. So the button will be calling this function. So we'll be adding the number of clicks to be 1. And right now what we need is to change our HTML file so that we can access the info. So let's go ahead and set this to be ID button info1. Okay. And we can look for that .get element by ID, and we called it button info1. And then we want to set its inner HTML to be clicks. Okay. But right now it's not going to work because we haven't mapped the button to that function. So all we have to do is change this to have an onClick property, and we'll be using add click. And you can see how it's adding to that number. But the second one doesn't work yet. So if I go ahead and refresh it, you can see that the number starts back again. And this is because the state is only saved for that instance of HTML. And so if you're trying to persist across state, it requires more than just a front-end application. Okay, so we want to handle the other one as well. So what we could do is make another function that does add clicks to, and this would be handling like the second button, but this could slowly get really convoluted. So what we'll be doing is using an array like we mentioned and just keeping track of that here. So another thing is we could take an argument. So in this case, we'll be taking in index, and we'll be changing the index to be adding 1. So this doesn't fix everything yet, but it can handle. So it shows both of them right now. So we also want to change this one to 0. The reason it's not working right now is because my onClick is not taking in the parameter of the index. So now it should work. But we want to handle the other one. So let's go ahead and look at the other button. So let's make this onClick equals add click 1. And we also need to add a better way of looking at this info. So what I can do is remove all of this ID because we're still changing the info on both. And instead of using document.getElement by ID, we're going to be using document.getElements by class name. So this gives us a list of all the elements that have a class name of info. So now that we have all of the elements with info, which are this 0 and this other 0, we want to change those to their own values. So we will go ahead and set, so it's an element. So let's go ahead and change this to element.enter HTML to its index. So this map function basically allows us to take the index of what we're looking at. So element.enter HTML equals to clicks of 0, or clicks of index. And so let's go ahead and look at it. One sec. No. Each. One second. Okay, so let's start back over. So this gives us our info. And we'll be looking for its index to be set to inner HTML equals to clicks at index. Let's try that. And so that fixes the 2 different click scenario. And it's just being kept track of using an array. So this .getElements by class name gives me a list of this resource, or this element and this element. So I'm just using the index to find whichever one it is and changing it to this array that's keeping track of it. So some of the extra stuff I wanted to talk about are some of the advanced practices you might want to learn as you keep growing and keep understanding more front-end development is, I guess, like API calls. I would start with jQuery. It's a good way to start. And there's a lot more APIs for this now with Fetch, with Axios. But basically, you're going to be using API calls if you ever want to use a backend. Look into some CSS frameworks. Understand immutability. So a lot of JavaScript is now leaning more towards immutabilities rather than mutability. So this just means things aren't allowed to change. And transitioning to a JavaScript framework, so React, Vue, Angular, Svelte, Ember. There's a couple more. These are probably the most prominent ones as of now. Look into TypeScript and maybe look into some more packages that can help solve your problems. Because if you've run into a problem, someone else has probably run into it and made a package for it. This is, I guess that's not right anymore, but questions, well, Are there any more questions regarding front end?
No questions at this time.
Okay.
So while we're waiting, Leon, what were some of the things that got you started with web development? And do you have like any resources that really helped you out?
I actually started with React, and trying to start there is very difficult because it's almost like starting with some advanced topic before learning the foundations of it. And in terms of resources, I would say your best one would be W3 Schools. It gives you a good overview of all that HTML can do, JavaScript can do, and CSS can do. And I would say in terms of CSS itself, I learned a lot of it through CSS tricks. Even to this day, I still use their Flexbox guide, and am looking into their grid guide because it's something I've just learned about. Basically, there's a lot to do in front end. There's a lot of enhancements that are coming out, and it's a lot of new things being added in. Did I answer the question?
Definitely. So we don't have any other questions, so I think that we might be good.
Okay. Are we ready to end the stream?
Sure.
Okay.
All right, y'all. Well, thanks for attending Leon's workshop. Awesome job, by the way, Leon. And if you have any questions for any of us about this topic or any of our meetings, feel free to reach out to Leon on Slack or one of the other ACM officers.
Okay. Thank you.